Folks. So for today's session, I'm going to talk about product design interview overview. Today, I'm going to use English. Unlike my other videos, I'm using Indonesian because this videos has been widely requested for everybody in the world. All the mentees that I've coached, there are a lot of resources about system design in the internet, be it like in a video or like talks or like in newsletter, but there is practically zero resources about product design. And this product design is more about product design for engineering, by the way, and not product design for UI UX people or product design for product manager. So without further ado, let's get to it. So now that I want to compare like between like system design and product design because I think that's the easiest comparison, right? So I assume that if you guys are here, right, you already know like what the system design is. If you don't know what the system design is, feel free to check out my video. It's in Indonesian though, but otherwise, you probably will see a lot of good resources already in the internet about what a system design is. Now let's try to compare what a system design versus product design. System design talk a lot about physical representation. What is physical representation? Physical representation means like how do you actually put the machines together, right? Is it going to be one machine? Is it going to be like multiple machines? Is the service is going to be in the same machine with the database, right? And that's why you talk a lot about scale, about numbers, about failover, right? Because it talks about like how do you decide, how do you put like all the machines together? Basically, like think about it as a CTO, right? How many machines do I need to spawn up, and how much is the cost that I need to incur to make sure that I can build this particular system, right? So that's why I talk a lot about DNS, like database, not even like in the database, right? They talk a lot about like the database engine, and less so about data schema. Even though you will eventually touch data schema, right? You talk about like message queue, you talk a lot about load balancer, right? Because it's all about like the physical representation. While in product design, you will talk a lot more about like the product experiences and the data flow. And that's why people mistakenly think that like product design is more about like thinking about API and data schema, because that's basically like what the logical representation of like a product, right? Like a logical representation of product is usually the how they interact with the system and how is it being stored within the system. But the thing is that like it's not the only thing that you talk about in product design. In product design, sometimes you have to think about like, hey, how does this user interact with the system? And it's not necessarily going to be like through like one user interface. Maybe sometimes you go through like a webhook through Slack. Sometimes you build like a mobile app. Sometimes you build like a web app. So there are many ways that like user interact with the systems, and you need to be creative about like who the users are and also how do they interact with the system. So what are the companies looking for in a product design? So these are the 7 things that the companies are looking for. I'm going to go one by one in the following slides. You start with like a problem explorations, right? Where, how do you do it? Is it like you by talking about like the functional requirement, non-functional requirement, and then the number assumptions, like how many users do you have, how many posts per day, how many read per day, right? Things like that. And then you talk about like data handling, which is like typically like the data flow from the client. What are the APIs being called, and what are the schema and data storage being stored? And then you goes into like the component responsibilities. This is like what the companies are looking for. Basically, like who are doing what they are supposed to do, right? So for example, can you split the components into like service separation of concern, right? Which is like who are doing the read, who are doing the write, who are tackling about users, who are tackling authentications, who are tackling about posts, right? Where is the database? Where who do the load balancing? Where are the queues, right? So basically, like in the drawing, the boxes, making sure like there are multiple boxes and not just one boxes is basically the easiest way to see that like, oh, you actually think about the component responsibilities properly. And then number 4 is completeness of the solution, which basically like do you address like all the functional and non-functional requirement, and also does all your API and the system are complete. For the people that are more senior, the interviewer will typically ask or prompt them to go a bit deeper, which talk about trade-off like SQL, NoSQL, REST versus gRPC, GraphQL, pull versus push, right? So you, as a senior, you need to come up with like multiple solutions and not just one, and then talk about the trade-offs, the pros and cons, and choose based on the numbers. And then for product design, quantitative analysis is typically not super important because we rarely talk about scales in product design. But typically some numbers that might be important is like the ratio between read and write, right? To know like what are the product use cases here? Is it like more, is there more people that are reading or is there more people that are writing, right? And that will typically influence like how the product flows. And finally, the deep dive is a little bit different between like system design and product design. System design will talk more about like how do you deep dive into like scalability, fault tolerance, security. The deep dive in product design will talk a lot more about experimentation, logging, migrations, right? So more about the product, less about the system. So how do you exactly product design, right? So as I mentioned before, right, there are like 7 stuff that we are looking for, and there are like how you do it, right? Basically, talk about functional requirement, non-functional requirement, numbers, high-level design, data API, data schema, and then deep dive optimizations, and then finally core puzzle. What is a core puzzle? A core puzzle is basically every single system design is going to be a bit different, right? And then there is going to be like one particular puzzle that you need to solve. Like for example, if you are talking about like design me newsfeed, right? The core puzzle might be something like, hey, how do we construct the feed for each particular user, right? Is it going to be like a broadcast mode or like is it going to be a pull mode, right? How do say, or another question, for example, how do I design Uber, right? And then the core puzzle is going to be like, how do I match between like the order from the rider and then the availability of the driver, right? So there is always going to be like one single core puzzle that you need to solve, and you need to go deep into that. And you can kind of like just touch upon the fluffs, like what database do you use, what API do you use, like those are something that you just have to lightly touch on, but you have to go deep into the core puzzle. That's how do you system design. In product design, it's going to be the same. So the flow of doing product design is going to be the same, except there's going to be like several stuff that you need to pay more attention to and some several stuff that you don't need to pay attention as much. Like for example, functional requirement in product design is super important. Why? Because sometimes the requirement in product design can be quite tricky, right? And that's the point. We kind of like want to see you like, can you be the product manager of the team, right? That's kind of like the purpose of product design as well. So it is purposefully fake and you need to kind of like gather and spend more time in functional requirement. Non-functional and numbers is not going to be super important, as I mentioned, because like scale and reliability of the system is not so much of a problem that we need to think about here. The high-level data design, data flow is super important because not only like in system design, for example, you talk about like the data flow from the user to like the database, right? Whether it goes through like load balancer or cache or queues, whatever. But you will also have to think about like how this data flows between multiple stakeholders, multiple users, to make sure like this data flows well end to end. Data API and data schema, those are very important because again, we are talking about the logical representation of the system, right? So, we need to think about the logical representation of the system. Data API and data schema is the core of like the logical representation. Not so much about the data storage engine, right? So you don't really have to think about like whether it's SQL or no SQL, right? I mean, it's good if you can talk about it, but that's not the point of product design. If you can mention it, it's going to impress the interviewer. But, it's more important that you talk more about data API and the schema. While the optimizations and the core puzzle in the system, in the interview, is still going to be the same. You still need to talk about optimization if you are talking about, interviewing for staff level above. And you still need to talk about core puzzle, come up with multiple solutions, and talk about trade-off. So for functional requirement, for example, right? You need to talk about it in use case. And sorry, not use case. You need to talk about it in like a user story, right? So something like, as a user, I can post comment to a post. As a driver, I can pick up someone. As a rider, I can request something, right? So try to make it into like a user story. And this is very important in product design because functional requirement is one of the most important part of product design. Non-functional requirement, not so important, honestly. Maybe what's important is like something like latency, right? Because low latency and high latency have different data flow. One is synchronous, the other one is asynchronous. That might impact the user experience. So you might need to think about that. But everything else, like whether you use horizontal scaling, vertical scaling, those doesn't really matter to the product. So you don't really have to talk about that. Quantitative analysis, again, not so important. Maybe one is the most important is just the read and write per second, right? And like maybe like the read and write ratio. And then high level design, very important, right? To draw the system end to end really well. You gotta draw arrows, right? And boxes, don't forget about that. So it's gonna look something like this, right? Again, very similar to system design. Where you can see this here, like the user goes to like a load balancer and then they go API gateway, and then you kind of like split the responsibilities between the read and write. Even though if they are physically in the same one machine, right? So it's very important to make sure that like you flow the data separately between read and write in product design, especially. Why? Because, again, going back, you need to think about the logical representation of the system, not the physical one. Even if physically they are in the same machine, you gotta put it in two different boxes. Data API, very important in product design. Why? Because, again, this is the core of product design. This is the core of logical representation of a system. You can talk about like whether I'm going to use REST or GraphQL. My preference during interview is always use REST because it's very human readable, right? And then the format is going to look like something like this. And data schema and storage. Data schema is important, storage not so much as I mentioned. And then the format is going to look like something like this. And then optimizations here, again, I think I mentioned this before, but like optimizations can go in many different ways. It gonna depends on like how good you are in your day-to-day job. Like if you are like an infra engineer, then you're gonna talk about like scalability more. But if you are an infra engineer, you probably will not get a product design. For product design, how do you this optimization is basically how do you impress the interviewer. So how do you do that? You do it by talking about like what things that you are good at during the day-to-day job, right? For example, I'm good at A/B testing. I'm good at monitoring. I'm good at building like feature engineering to you pipe it down into machine learning. So go talk about it. So basically, optimization is about like impressing the interviewer and talk about trade-offs. So I want to talk briefly about like just showing you what is the difference about like a system design newsfeed and a product design newsfeed API. So let's talk about newsfeed. So let's talk about newsfeed in the context of system design. So in newsfeed, like you typically will do something like you have a user. Actually, let me just use this. You have a user that's gonna talk to like So you will get, by the way, you will get exactly the same requirement, right? Hey, please design me a new suite, right? And then it's gonna be different between like system design, product design. When you talk about like system design, you're gonna talk a lot more about how do you make sure the system works well, and then how do you make sure it's scalable. So API gateway, and then you have like a load balancer here. So NewsFeed has the write and read. So I'm gonna be writing the write post here, and then I'm gonna be reading the post here. Read feed actually, not a post. So let's imagine that this is gonna be in the same machine. And then I'm gonna talk to like a particular database. Super simple. Now, the thing here is that like this is the difference between like a new suite and the system design, new suite and product design. In a new suite of system design, I'm gonna talk more about like how do I construct the feed itself, right? How does that work? And then, how do you make sure it scales? Now you gotta think in system design, you gotta think about like, okay, how do I construct a feed? I mean, the read feed need to be quite fast, right? The read feed need to be quite fast. Maybe like you are expecting something like 100 millisecond latency. So it means this read feed need to read from some kind of a cache. They cannot be reading from like a database. So cache. I'm thinking like we should be doing a key value pair. So key value cache. So it can be something like a user and then like list of content, right? Now the thing here is that like whether the question here is that like do I pull to populate this data or do I push? I mean what I mean by that. I mean is that like when I'm I can do like a something like a cron job, right? To kind of like build like the feed and read from the post database. Hey, do I have a new news that I need to put into this particular cache? If I don't, then I skip. If I do, I put it in the cache. That's the first solution. The second solution is that like every single time I write a post, right, I can go to like a feed aggregator and have somebody decide like, hey, who should be reading this, right? If I should be reading this, then like this feed aggregator is gonna populate it into this. I'm not gonna talk too much about like the details here because I already covered this in like one of my other videos. But let's say like this is like how I'm gonna do the how I'm gonna populate the cache, and like this is also how am I gonna let the newsfeed get the data. This is solving newsfeed system design in a system design way, right? Now let's try to solve this in a product design way. So in a product design, you probably don't care too much about like how this is being aggregated. The thing that you care a lot is about like how is this going to be served to the client, right? So especially like you gotta think about like, hey, what are all the contents that is going to be served in the feed? Like for example, if you have video, you have photo, and then you have like just text only, and then you have, for example, live video, right? Then you are thinking about like, okay, there are several content format here that I need to pass to the client. All right, now I gotta think about like how do I populate the data to the client. So the first thing that we have to do to think about is that like, okay, I'm gonna be sending a list. So first off, I need to be sending a list, maybe something like this, right? And then each of the content is gonna contain like the ID of the post, and then it's gonna contain like the poster, or maybe something like this. User ID, name, profile picture. I'm just thinking about like what I'm gonna use, what kind of data that I'm gonna use to kind of like make the product usable, right? So, so I imagine like this is like a newsfeed. There's like this content. There is probably gonna be some comment down here, and there's like profile pictures here. There is gonna be like some text, here. There's gonna be some content. So with that in mind, I'm thinking about separating the content against the text. So there's gonna be like the message, which is going to be a string, or is it going to be, no, there can be some link there. So there might be, some rich media text. So what I mean by rich text is that like it's a text, but it can contain some links, right? So it can be in some form of structures there. And then the content can be like content. First, it needs to be an enum, which is a type. Which is, it can be like a video or photo or text or live video, and then I'll have the URL for the source, which is going to be a string. I think this should be okay. And then thinking about the user experience, right, about the newsfeed, it's going to be like scrolling, right? It's not going to be a paginated newsfeed. So what I'm going to do is say like, I'm just going to ask them to have like a pagination. Oops. So next cursor and then slam ID, right? And then there's like a previous cursor. Maybe I don't need the previous cursor because like I'm not going to be paging to the previous ID anyway, but you know, for completion's sake. So as you can see here, like, you know, I'm talking about the same problem. It's newsfeed, right? But when I talk about system design, I think about it from like the system way, the how do I build the physical representation? How does the data flow? And then like exactly what are the different machines that needs to be involved here? But in product API, I'm more interested about like how do I actually build the product experience, right? API is gonna be a lot. It's gonna be talk a lot, right? But it is not the only thing that we are going to talk about, right? So I'm gonna give an example later on about like why product design is not just about API, but I'm gonna put it into the next video. Okay. So this is kind of like the spectrum of questions between like system design and product design, right? So there are several questions that is like actually extreme system design, which is you will only get it if you are like an infra engineers or like an embedded engineers or like, you know, SRE interview positions. You will get things like memcached, distributed file system, load balancer. You're not gonna talk about the product at all, right? It's basically just talking about the infrastructure. Or there is another extreme of the spectrum, which is like purely product design. You don't talk at all about scalability. You don't talk at all about like the physical representation. You only talk about like the logical representation of the system. So a few example of that is like, you know, building localization service and then the private setting. Now, typically, most questions will fall in between, in the middle, right? And that's why, like, and it's also like what the interviewer prefer, because like sometimes people don't know whether they are good at system design, product design, and the interviewer will sometimes try to adjust based on like how good the candidate are. So they will try to ask the question in the middle, right? That is like that can go into system design that talks more about physical representation, or they can shift into product design if needed and talk more about logical representation. Being good at both is totally possible, right? And it's totally possible to explain both aspects really well. And if you can do that, then you know you probably are an L7 or an L8 at this point. So that's kind of the spectrum of the question. And honestly, there are not really that many learning materials. You only have like several questions, several links in YouTube that is quite good. I think they're decent, not the best, honestly. But they can show you like, you know, what a product design might look like. You know, if you answer it like, if you answer your product design like this, even though it's like it's more similar to system design, I believe you still got a good chance to get accepted. So that's it. That's from me. So in the next video, I'm probably going to cover like one of the extreme product design question, which is called localization service. But otherwise, see you in the next video. Stay coding.